Hello and welcome. My name is Nathan Ferris, Vice President for the Dungeons and Dragons Club here at Washburn University. This is a recording of the writing workshop that took place December 2nd for our Teens in Space Gencon story. What we're going over today and what I'm going to be recapping as well is our first story that we wrote and ran at Gencon in 2019 called Attack of the Brocklights. I'm going to introduce what is needed to know for the Teens in Space setting in order to get writing. I'm going to talk about the storyboard ideas that we came up with, just a little bit of them. That way you are up to date with what we discussed in the workshop. And the goal of all of this is to create a story to be used at Gen Con 2023. This story is going to be playtested next semester, starting in January. We're going to submit it in January, the actual story, to Gen Con. And we also have goals to even get this published with the writers of the book, with Jonathan Gilmour and Doug Levandowski. Great people, great system, highly recommend it, and it's a lot of fun. So let's get started. I will be starting here with our actual first story, Attack of the Brocklights. Feel free to read along with me, but I'm going to show you just a very, very brief overview of the story that we ran and wrote. That way you are up to date with where we're starting from. Starting out, we have a group of friends hanging out around town on their bikes, riding around before sleepover. They found themselves in the woods, around the woods, and in that woods, there was an old factory situated somewhere inside of it. They weren't at it, it's just there. And as they're going about their night, they see an extremely bright light crash into the woods. They assumed around that old factory. It was further and deeper into the woods. They're scared, and they rode their bikes as fast as they could back to their friend's home. And after feasting on some snacks and playing video games, they soon just fell into the night, went to sleep until they woke up. This is where our story actually begins for our players. And as the group of friends wake up, they could smell an intense aroma from the kitchen. Billy, one of the characters and one of the players, Billy's mom was cooking a breakfast that didn't smell like breakfast. It was where they found out that she was scooping up huge helpings of steamed broccoli onto their plates. She insisted that they eat it up, not letting a single sprout go untouched. And she was also obviously played different. She was played as and portrayed as kind of semi-aggressive and persistent. Something wrong with her, over-energetic and trying to push this broccoli into the kid's face. Obviously, with the characters that we had, but also the players picking up on this. They were freaked out. They were on their toes, obviously noticing something's not right. And so they wanted to avoid her. They made an excuse that they needed to get to school, but Billy's mom wasn't too swayed. Eventually, she would settle for some kind of solution where the broccoli could follow the kids to school. And this most of the times looked like getting Ziploc baggies to put this veggie into that the kids took to school. However, and the reason for the format for the first story being like this is a side note. Many of these solutions had many outcomes, and a lot of the times the players helped come up with it. So, back to our first story. Weirded out, the kids made their way out of the house. So, hopping on their bikes, they pedaled to school, discussing everything, what just happened in the morning, what happened last night, their thoughts on it, while also being able to explore a little bit of the town on their way to school. Side note here that Billy was most confused by this, and the player character, and this is where we had the first of many elements for older players and more experienced players to use more so character knowledge to influence the story more, such as Billy knowing his mom, knowing how she acted, and able to add different tidbits of information. So on their way to school, they notice another thing out of place. There is not a single soul around. They're able to explore around school, finding nobody. They're able to explore around the parking lots, finding the school buses that are already parked and done with their routes, which is unusual, as they're still noting. It seems as though either there's no school or everybody's already at school, and they find the latter. Because as they arrive, while there being no kids outside, the sound of laughter or shouting, thinking about what they just saw this morning, and traversing through the hallways, most are groups deciding for a sneaky approach or a stealthy approach. They decide to make their way to the cafeteria. In the cafeteria, they find huge stock pots of cheese for the nacho day at lunch, having left on the stoves, beginning to simmer. And as they've made their way through the halls, and they notice that they're in the classrooms, they have classmates sitting in the classroom in a zombie-like appearance or trance, staring forward towards the chalkboards. They notice this propaganda-like posters, handouts, drawings, pictures, everything you can think of broccoli and how it's good for you. They also noticed that their teachers were replaced with short stubs and big poofy hair, not one of them recognizable as a teacher they knew. And no matter which classroom they peeked into, the story was the same. The kids eventually run into their veggie-hating janitor, whose Leroy name change, Leroy Jones. He takes them to the janitor's office and shows off his theory board and what he thinks is happening. Now, Leroy is this only human who seems sane, in fact, the only human around they could find, or not human, only adult around they could find. And he is some kind of conspiracy theorist, having apparently planned or prepped and made a lot of notes on what might be happening as he's taken note of the changes. The group realizes, whether it be through their substitute teachers, whether it be through Brock-like aliens through the halls, the cooks in the cafeteria, however it is that there are these broccoli-like aliens called Brocklites, and they are set on influencing, convincing, even mind controlling these students in the school about broccoli. Now, there is something that they can use to their advantage, as someone brings up the idea that broccoli is only good when there's cheese on it. After all, who doesn't like cheese? So Leroy the janitor offers up to the group confiscated water guns, balloons, slingshots, anything else that they can use. And the solution again here is very open. Many of the characters, many of the players had ideas and created for a lot of fun, or made a lot of fun. So they head to the kitchen, filling everything up with hot cheese, and that's when they first find out how to defeat the Brocklites with this hot cheese. So after they defeat the aliens and either drive them all out, send them all away where they run into the forest, or go through and just take them out, they notice that everyone's still under a trance, that everyone is still paying attention to this broccoli propaganda. This is where they remember the crash in the woods, and Leroy helping the group here, if needed, sometimes not. They make their way to the woods to defeat the source of the issue, where they battle more of the Brocklites and the Brocklite King, who is coming from this crashed spaceship. Once this king was destroyed, everyone eventually woke up from their trance, and life went on like nothing had changed except for the spaceship in the woods. And to note, that was not in this edit right here of the story, that Leroy was revealed to actually be this sort of AI or artificial intelligence, as he somehow knew or connected with the ship in some way. That was not expanded on and purposely left because, well, at the time ideas were fun, but now it's a great source to actually talk about and lead into our second story. But this was our first story. This is where we're starting from. This is what we ran. And this story will be polished, of course, and all the juicy details across the 30-some plus pages that we'll be submitting as the final draft because of the many solutions to the story is what we're starting from. This is what we're using, and in terms of direction for the story that we're writing here for Teens in Space, in terms of what you have to have is this knowledge in the back pocket. We are coming from Earth. We are coming from this group of kids at this school. Not necessarily named, but probably will be eventually. And that they met and encountered and defeated these Brocklites, and that there's a spaceship here, and that Leroy is not a human. He's something else. And that is what we're going from. So to understand the Kids on Bikes system, picture of the cover on the left, again, great adventure, check it out. There are 3 things mechanic-wise that I need to go over for us to understand both of these systems, which with the same system, but both these settings. The first is that this chart here shows us how the dice are related to the difficulty class, or the DC, of the challenges in the game, meaning a higher number, the harder it is to do. Well, the players and their attributes or their stats work in a similar way. Not everybody has, like in other systems, not everybody rolls a d20 plus a modifier for a stat. Using our first story and the named character that we put in there, Billy, Billy had this background class mix of a trope of a bully. His brawn, or his brute strength and lifting, physical prowess and intimidation, his brawn was very high, a 20. He rolled a 20 for that. But his brains were terrible. He rolled a d4 for that. So know that the stats are related to a die, and they're not all rolling the same die. And they mix and match depending on the trope that they are, which we'll talk about later. Now, teens in space. I broke it down into 6 bullet points needed in order to understand the system enough to start writing under a broad category of what the game or the system and setting is. Firstly, obviously, it's set in or involving space. We are using space and elements of things that happen in space, whether it be aliens, non-human races, spaceships, and things like that. Do know that there are improvements characters can take, as well as the ships that they pilot, leading for a lot of creative and very fun interactions and encounters and devices and technology. So know that that exists. It does expand and have a very in-depth field there that we won't talk about in detail today, but know that it is there. So this can be low tech, low fantasy sci-fi. This can be high tech and technology. It's up to you. Our 4th point is that talking about teenagers coming from Kids on Bikes is that our story has developed, our story has evolved with the system, with teens in space. So our characters that we're going to have as pregens for our story will be teenagers. But that does not mean every character is a teenager, such as Leroy. He's this older AI who took the form of this adult. But we could also introduce some other non-player characters or NPCs that are older. We can introduce enemies that are older. We can introduce, if you have the idea of a player character who is older. That does not mean you cannot do that, by all means. But know that it is geared towards this idea of a developing setting and narrative. Now, these last 2 points are the second and third part of what makes Teens in Space and Kids on Bikes such a great, amazing system for narration and a story. Remember, I talked about our first being that the stats are linked to a die and not every stat getting the same die. Now, you might ask yourself from that, well, if I have a D4, how do I ever get a 20 difficulty class or a challenge of 20? Well, the first is exploding dice. In short, anytime you roll the max die number on a die, you get to roll it again. So if we go back to our chart, if I'm Billy and I had some kind of check using my brains or book smarts solving intellectual problems, and I rolled a 4, I can roll again. If I roll a 4, I can roll again and again and again until I don't hit a 4. So that 20 can happen, and I've seen something crazy happen where I believe it was a D8 or 6 or a 10 where someone rolled like a 36 or something crazy. It happens. That exists. So that is how, even though if, for example, going back to the chart again, if Billy were terrible on the bottom on the D4, if he were terrible at brains, that doesn't mean he cannot do something smart and intelligent. That does not mean he cannot. He can always try. He can always do so. And that leans into the fact that if he were to do something requiring his strength, that is not about fighting, his brawn, which was given the D20, he has a much easier time doing something like that than anybody else. And that's how it works. That's the second part. The third and final part of the mechanics we're talking about today is narrative control. And I put an asterisk next to this because it is, in my opinion, the most important thing to understand when this system is played, and by extension, how we approach writing this. Narrative control is, in short, the players take a more active approach to storytelling in the game. It is more so thought of as a 50-50 relationship. The players and the dungeon master both tell the story. How? Well, let's say Billy had an example. He had some door that was locked. And let's say it was like a bolted iron barred door and impossible to get through. We're going to set the challenge at 30. Insanely strong door, hard to get through. Well, the player who's playing Billy is like, well, I'm going to use this like crowbar that he found in Leroy's office, for example. And I'm going to use this leverage to somehow just run at the door with all my might and somehow get it open and bust it down. I don't care if it is damaged or not. And I'm like, great, roll me a brawn check. Let's say he hits a nat 20 on the die. Great. But it's still not the DC, but he gets to roll again. And let's say he rolls a 10. We add them together. That's 30. How that looks for exploding dice is that some outside influence happens. Something completely random might help him in this endeavor. Not necessarily another player character, but something of the environment. And he'll tell me, I tell him, well, that succeeds. Tell me how that works. What does that look like? How do you bust the door down? And he'll tell me, he blows over this door and the lock is shattered behind it and the door just swings open. Great, awesome. I'm also going to add to that being like, yeah, like that is great. If he succeeded, perfect. He's telling me how that happens, and that's great. If he were to fail and instead rolled like a 19, and he told me that he was going to do the same thing. I blow down this door, the bar behind it just shatters off. He tells me that, and I go, you start to do that, or that starts to happen with all your might, you push, but you cannot get leverage. You cannot get past a certain barrier that's blocking you. Of course, this is just one example in millions, but it helps you at least see how the player does take an active role in the control of the narrative. And they build it with me. They tell me how the solutions end up being how they are, and I redirect how that looks with the result of the role that they have. Why is this important to talk about for writing? Well, between the stats relating to a die, exploding dice, and narrative control, we create a system which focuses and leans back into the narrative. It's all about the story, and that the story we're playing through and developing and progressing through. And that's why it's worth mentioning, even for the writing. Now, I'm going to talk about two more things, the first of which are the actual characters. The characters, and all characters have this, not just the player characters, they have four things that make them. Firstly, it's the species. There are many species, both human, non-human. And in terms of how you're limited, the sky is the limit. It can be anything. The book gives over 20 crazy combinations of amazing creatures, from these tiny people who explore the galaxy in giant android exoskeletons, to water-breathing humanoids, to these lizards, to these bugs, to sentient water, to intelligent bears. It's up to you what kind of race you might want to introduce, especially going back to the point of the Brocklights. How did the Brocklights develop? How did the Brocklights evolve? Are they just some subservient race that is being controlled by some bigger, stronger, more powerful race? Or do the Brocklights evolve themselves? Are they like from this world of plant people? Do we go to that world? So many ideas and questions you can explore. But the species all come with very minor +1 stat bonuses or improvements, such as Brawn. Billy, from his bully trope or background, would get a +1 to his Brawn. So there are modifiers. And know that as we jump into trope, it is this mixture of a class that we might know from another system and a background. That is a combination of the two, and it dictates or defines which stats get linked with which die, the D20 to the D4. Thirdly, each character has a fatal flaw, something they're trying to overcome, something that they're trying to work past. For example, looking back to the first story and the one I gave, maybe Billy is afraid of heights. That might stop him from doing certain things. That might make him scared to do certain things. And players who lean into this flaw and who play with it more are awarded, and there are mechanics for that. But they're awarded for playing into that, and it helps create a more fleshed out character. Somebody is trying to overcome something that they're scared of, or some kind of relation that they have with somebody. Maybe they wronged the wrong people and they're laying low. Speaking of that fatal flaw, we actually jump into the fourth and final point, relationships. In short, the book has positive and negative questions that we answer with our character to help define how they interact with the world around them and the people. Things like your species, your trope, and your fatal flaw all come with these questions to consider and answer for your character. These questions could be things like, where did you meet, looking back in our Kids on Bikes cast, how did you meet these other kids? Did you meet them at school, the playground? Did you go and build your treehouse together? Did you just hang out and all had bikes at the school? How do you interact with each other in the world, the town? What do you want to be when you grow up? Things like that. Things that are simple, but also vast. If we're looking at Teens in Space, what if you're some emperor of some mass trade fleet? How does that person interact with the other trading fleets? How does he interact with this galaxy, this system, this planet, this person? It's as big or as simple as you want it, but know that they all help defining how the character interacts with the world. And that is the lecture, the presentation that was given. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is just some of the talking points that we had from the actual working session from the writing portion, where we created web designs or web layouts. And we talked about more elements from our first story we wanted to expand on. Elements from the first story we're expanding on, obviously, Leroy. The idea of who he is. How does he involve himself with the story? We're also talking about the goal the Brocklights had. Why were they at Earth in the first place? Was it just to take over? Or something more? We also talked about how we can relate this to other stories in our own media and our own culture, especially with a heavy influence that Kids on Bikes, Teens in Space brings from things like the 70s and the 80s, stories like E.T. We also look at things like Stranger Things and the things that Stranger Things were influenced by. All of them are great when talking about how does this influence a story like Attack of the Brocklights as we transition and develop that into Teens in Space. Lastly, talking more about the second story and what that looks like, we wanted to take this space, have elements of space in there, the spaceships, the aliens. We want to develop and touch upon that. There is a great and vast world that Jonathan and Doug introduce here, and we want to use that. We want to see how that works with our own story and play around with it and have all the players who play our game interact with. So one idea was like, what if there's a distress signal on that broken down, now semi-repaired spaceship after the years have gone by? What if that distress signal brings in some kind of new enemy or more Brocklights who are essentially, maybe they abduct the party, maybe they bring the spaceship back or send some people down to take the spaceship again? What if this new spaceship that comes in houses the new enemy? What if this spaceship that comes in is there for Leroy? What if he's important in some way? What if there's another character who's important? What if the kids have to go save someone, escape from something, infiltrate something? What if this new ship that comes to Earth calls in some bigger, badder ship? And as the kids, now teens, the teens explore this ship and take it over in space, they see that there's this bigger, badder mothership coming in. What do? And that is, in short, what we talked about. But know that, again, you have complete creative freedom. But keep in mind our first story. Keep in mind where we're starting from, what we're building from, and have fun. Again, you can always reach out to me at nathan.ferris@washburn.edu with all of your ideas. Again, I'll have forms within our presence link for the playtesting workshops coming up, as well as if you want to be involved more than just this first step with the writing process, please reach out to me. This is a great opportunity that leads into so much more than just writing some ideas down, as we can actually playtest this, submit this, have people play it, even have opportunities for this to be submitted into the actual Teens in Space book. What if this story is part of some Teens in Space adventure? How cool would that be, that you had a hand in that? And that's what this is. Again, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to hearing from you. Again, my name is Nathan. Bye-bye.